Welcome to the third and final part of our discussion on the Great Depression. Now, starting in 1935, we have what's generally referred to as the Second New Deal. This New Deal focused much more on social justice. It was considered more radical in that it was changing many basic elements of society. You'll recall the first New Deal was designed largely to provide immediate relief to the jobless, to get the banks up and running, etc. And as he introduced the new legislation, FDR said, social justice is no longer a distant ideal. It has become a definitive goal. And we'll look at a few of the major programs here in the next few minutes. Yet another alphabet soup agency, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, was a massive federal construction program designed to provide employment for the jobless. It quickly became the country's largest employer, and indeed, it provided jobs for fully 1/3 of the unemployed people in the United States. Congress shortly thereafter passed the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act. This is by far the most important labor law in the United States. It guaranteed workers the right to organize unions and bargain directly with management. Now, the Social Security system was set up at this time, and of course, Social Security still exists and is a major element of the federal government, as we'll see in a few minutes. Unfortunately, the Great Depression's worst impact was on the elderly, many of whom lost all of their savings, and the disabled. The Social Security Act is passed by Congress and signed by the President, was set up to deal with this and provide an entirely new type of retirement system for workers. Roosevelt himself said it was the, quote, cornerstone and the supreme achievement of the New Deal. Something like the Social Security system had been proposed by progressives in the Progressive Era and had already been adopted by most European countries. It is essentially, then and now, a self-financed retirement program. Workers must contribute from their wages, and then upon retirement age, workers receive a payment which depends on the number of years in which they were contributing, as well as the amount of money they contributed. It also provided assistance to widows or widowers, the survival part of the of Social Security, which provides today benefits to millions and millions of survivors of a worker who passed away, as well as young children. At the same time, they also established a joint federal and state government unemployment program, and this was financed by a payroll tax on employers. And a version of this still exists today, and this is workers don't pay anything into this, but companies must pay money to the state government and to set up a fund to provide unemployment benefits in the event that any worker in the state is unemployed. Now, this is an early poster on the benefits of the Social Security system. A monthly check will be sent to you for the rest of your life, beginning when you are age 65. And so this is a poster telling people to get their Social Security number. And you need your Social Security number, of course, to to enroll. And I'm sure many of you have Social Security numbers, and most of you have had jobs or perhaps are working now. And what happens is a certain amount of your income is automatically taken out of your paycheck by your employer, and that is put into an account, and you get credits to your account. And under current law, you have to have a minimum of the equivalent of 10 years of work in Social Security to be eligible for a benefit when you retire at 65. However, if someone is working and they pass away, their children under the age of, I think it's 18, are entitled to Social Security benefits, as is a spouse. Now, Roosevelt wanted workers to fund their own Social Security pension as entitlements. And by entitlement here, the word is a little confusing. Now, if days of you hear something, you're entitled to something, that means like you should get it. But at this time, in this sense, it meant something workers had paid for and therefore they deserved from the government later. So in other words, workers are entitled to receive Social Security because they are going to be paying for it during their working lives. Now, conservatives condemned this as socialist and said it was too much government meddling, that people should just save their own money. Social Security today is known as the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance. And any of you who've worked, you've probably noticed in your paycheck, hopefully you have, that you'll have deductions from your pay. And the OASDI is 6.2% of your wages. And then you also pay Medicare, which is a separate healthcare system for the elderly. And in addition to each worker paying 6.2%, the employer matches that. So the employer will say, pay the same 6.2% tax on wages up to a certain amount. As I'm recording this, it's about $120,000 a year. So if you make $200,000 a year, you don't pay Social Security past $120,000. But there are many proposals in Congress to increase that limit to $300,000 or $400,000 because that generates more money for the Social Security system, obviously. If you're self-employed, you pay double. And as I mentioned, the program is set up so that when you contribute during your working life, you are entitled to file for Social Security. When it was set up, it was at age 65. Of course, life expectancy was much less in the 1930s. Right now, for me, it's age 67, minimum retirement age for full retirement. And for my children, it's age 67. There's a great desire to reduce the liabilities of the Social Security system as we have more and more elderly people, and their proposals to increase the age even higher to reduce the number of people who are drawing Social Security. And it's paid not just for the worker, but for the spouse, for a surviving spouse, and it's all, or minor children. It also has a form of disability insurance, which means if you are working and you suffer, and it doesn't have an accident, it doesn't have to be job related. You could have a car accident, you could have a disease, whatever. Social Security, after receiving medical documentation of the disability, will provide a monthly disability insurance check. Well, just to give you an idea of how extensive Social Security is today in the United States, this slide is for 1915, but it's just about the same today. Social Security is in the lower right-hand corner of this pie chart in red. And it was 24, almost 1/4 of all federal spending was for Social Security. And that amount as a share of the federal budget is expected to increase because more and more people are living longer thanks to better medical care, and also their people have had fewer children for a number of years, so there are fewer workers contributing to pay more people's retirement. And this is a serious problem in the future, and it's going to have to be dealt with. Just while we're focusing on this pie chart, it's sort of interesting to see defense expenditures were 16% of federal expenditures. Net interest, this is interest on the money the federal government borrows because the revenues are less than the expenses, is about 6% of federal spending. And that amount will be going up because of the huge debt. You can see healthcare. This is federal spending on healthcare, 25% of the federal budget. This is Medicare program for elderly people, their programs for the poor, and of course health care provided to military members and their their dependents and retirees. And what you can see, other mandatory spending is 13%. So this is an interesting pie chart. And of course, you probably studied this in economics classes. But my point here is Social Security has grown to be a major item. And it's an item that requires people, doesn't matter their political party, their political persuasion, everybody agrees something needs to be done over the next 10 or 15 years because there are just fewer people working and there are more people living longer years to draw Social Security. Okay, now back to the 1930s. And many people remember FDR, what he wanted to do was raise taxes on the rich. And remember, he was very wealthy himself, his family, and all his close friends. And so Congress raised taxes significantly on the wealthy. Now, the conservatives obviously said that was socialism, but Roosevelt said, look, we need the money for these programs. And he said, quote, I am fighting communism. I want to save our system, our capitalist system. And you have to remember at this very time in the this is 1930s, but in the 1920s, as we saw before, the Soviet Union had become a communist country. And many young people, liberal people, were very impressed with the Soviet Union, with the propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union. And they said, look at the great poverty in the United States. Of course, there was great poverty in the Soviet Union also. So Roosevelt was trying to save the capitalist system. But he did believe very strongly in a more equal distribution of the wealth. Roosevelt was reelected in 1936 in another landslide election. He won, this time, all the states except Maine and Vermont. And Congress became even more strongly dominated by Democrats. So Roosevelt had Congress behind him, but as he saw it, his problem was the Supreme Court. Now, you recall that 4 Supreme Court justices had been appointed by Republican presidents in the 1920s. And Roosevelt was really worried that the Supreme Court was going to move against his second New Deal, including programs like the Social Security Act. And during his first New Deal, which was 1933 to 1935, the Supreme Court had ruled against 7 of the 9 cases it heard. So 7 of the 9 cases dealing with the first New Deal were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Now, it's important to remember, and this is in contemporary news, people are talking about increasing the size of the Supreme Court. The Constitution itself does not specify how many judges are on the Supreme Court. It just says the Supreme Court this will be determined by Congress and all the other federal courts, which of course now we have the appeals courts and the district courts. So it's been 9 for well over 100 years. And it had been more than that sometimes it had been 5. So, Congress could change the number of justices then, and now it could. And it doesn't require a constitutional amendment because you're not changing or amending anything in the Constitution. So Roosevelt came up with what's been known as a court packing scheme plan. He wants to pack justices who agree with him politically into the Supreme Court. So Roosevelt himself came up with what he thought was this clever idea to increase the membership of the Supreme Court by up to 6 new judges or justices. And he made the major political mistake. He didn't even consult his closest aides. He didn't consult the Democratic leaders of Congress, his own party. He just came out and announced on the radio that he was proposing that Congress name 6 new justices. That would be 1 for each current justice over the age of 70. And Roosevelt came out and said, well, we all know as people age, they can't work quite as quickly as they could in the past. They're not as agile mentally. And, so we need to have every justice over the age of 70 have another judge to help them. And not an assistant, mind you, a full-fledged judge with a vote. And he said, there's so much work, they're falling behind, they need help. Well, this created outrage, not only among Republicans, but particularly among Democrats who hadn't been consulted. And it was obvious that this was going to make the Supreme Court even more of a political institution than it has always been. Well, the net result of the so-called court packing plan was it greatly damaged the prestige and reputation of FDR. Many had viewed him before this as a person dedicated to help those suffering from unemployment or poor health. Now he was just viewed as, quote, just another politician. All he cared about was his politics. He didn't care about the institutions. And I put in red, and I think it's generally acknowledged that the court packing scheme was Roosevelt's greatest political mistake and a great personal humiliation. Now let's take a step back and look at the New Deal. Was it a success or a failure? Well, there's no question that the New Deal programs helped ease hardship for many millions of Americans. People who were jobless received work. It may have been literally just making a trail in a state forest or something, but it got people out of the house, probably prevented many people from becoming seriously depressed and killing themselves or becoming alcoholics or something. But it there certainly did have a great role in easing hardship. But when you step back and look at it, it didn't restore prosperity to the country, nor did it even significantly reduce unemployment. Unemployment was still 17% in 1939. And in 1939, you recall, in September 1939, France and Britain and a number of other countries went war with Germany, and the United States didn't enter the war for over 2 years later. But starting in 1939, the United States started producing more and more weapons to send to Britain and uh, and France. So many tanks, many armaments, and so U.S. industrial production greatly increased. And that's when unemployment started coming down. Unfortunately, Roosevelt did very little to assist blacks, specific programs for blacks in the country. And the real reason is much of the support in Congress for the Democrats was from conservatives in the South. Conservative Southern Democrats held a lot of power in Congress, and he didn't want to alienate them. He needed the support of the conservative and racist Southern Democrats to get his programs through Congress. And progressives had wanted, during the progressive era, regulation of business to ensure equal opportunity for all. And Roosevelt's program certainly helped achieve that. But Roosevelt really wanted the government to provide a minimum quality of life for all. He looked at it, as we saw during the Second New Deal, in terms of social justice. And the final, I think, major legacy of the New Deal was that the government became much more proactive, and the size and involvement of the federal government increased greatly during the New Deal, and did not return to its previous level after the New Deal. In fact, as we'll see during World War II, the size and involvement of the federal government increased even more. Well, thank you very much.